afternoon and good evening to the night owls who might be joining us from across the ocean. I am Magda Tedder. I'm the Schridler Chair in Judaic Studies at Fordham, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Derek Penslar about Zionism and Emotional State, which is a preview of his book, which we hope will be forthcoming next year, about the emotional history of Zionism. Derek Penslar is no stranger to Fordham. He joined us earlier this year in our series Black Studies and Jewish Studies in Conversation. He currently holds the William Lee Frost Professor of Jewish History at Harvard University. He previously taught at Indiana University, University of Toronto, and Oxford University, where he was the inaugural holder of the Stanley Lewis Chair in Modern Israel Studies. Derek Penslar takes a comparative and transnational approach to Jewish history, and he's a prolific writer and a generous colleague. His books include Shylock's Children, Economics and Modern Identity in Modern Europe, Israel in History, The Jewish State in Comparative Perspective, Origins of the State of Israel, a Documentary History, which he edited with Eran Kaplan, Jews in the Military, a History, and most recently, Theodor Herzl, The Charismatic Leader, which came out in 2020 and for which we have a discount code from Yale University Press. He is currently completing the book I mentioned, Zionism and Emotional State, and is also beginning to work on a global history of the 1948 Palestine War. Derek Penslar is currently the president of the American Academy for Jewish Research, a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and an honorary fellow of St. Anne's College at Oxford. Before I hand over the screen to Derek, I want to express my thanks to all of you who are joining us today and who have joined us at our other events, and for your generosity and support. All those events we offer would be impossible without you. I want to give particular thanks to the Knapp Family Foundation and the Pickett Family Foundation for their support of the Center for Jewish Studies. We're grateful, and again, without any of that support, we couldn't exist. So Derek, the screen is yours.
Okay, excellent. So today I'm going to be sharing material with you from the final chapter of a book that I completed a few months ago called Zionism and Emotional State. It's a book that appears in a series with Rutgers University Press titled Keywords in Jewish Studies. So there was a volume on the Haskalah that was done by Olga Litvak, and I think Daniel Boyarin did one on Judaism. His brother did one on Jewish families, his brother Jonathan Boyarin, and so on. So keywords, I think Jeffrey Chandler did one on the shtetl, and I'm doing the one on Zionism. And the way the book is set up, there's a theme or a kind of pattern to these books, is that the first section lays out sort of the way we think about the subject at present. And then the second section talks about controversies in those approaches. And then there's a final section called In a New Key. So the first two sections of the book lay out, conventional understandings of Zionism and what I think is wrong with them. And then in the final section, I go into my, as they would say in Yiddish, my chiddush, my innovation, which is to offer a kind of new way of thinking about the history of Zionism through the lens of emotion. As some of you may know, the history of emotions has become a very important field. Just a second, I'm trying to move. There we go. History of emotions has become an important field really over the past 30 or more years. Jewish history in general has been slow to catch on. Jewish history is usually about a generation behind other fields in cashing in, as it were, under methodological approaches. And the history of Zionism is particularly, I'd say, underserved by engagement with the methodologies of the history of emotion. For the most part, Zionism is dealt with, and this is not a question of political judgment, whether one likes Zionism or doesn't, It is usually structured as an ideology, so a rather coherent series of principles, or as a movement, a political and social movement, more broadly understood perhaps as a project. These are terms that people usually use to describe Zionism, but I contend that Zionism, really like any form of modern collective identification, particularly ethno-national forms of identification, has to be seen in terms of affect, and what I call in the book affective bundles, because emotions don't exist in isolation. And I think this is one of the mistakes with the field of the history of emotions that I'm trying to address in the book, is that you'll have books on like the history of fear or the history of shame or the history of anger. A lot of people who work in emotions history do this. And that's heuristically extremely interesting. But in real life, people feel multiple emotions simultaneously. They rise and fall, they crest and decline in a matter of milliseconds. And what I deal with in the book, very broadly understood, is a concept of emotion that really goes back to the scholastics about motions of the soul that is moving towards and away. I mean, emotion, back from its Latin roots. And so like Barbara Rosenwein, who's pioneered the field of emotions history, I do speak of emotions in this very broad sense of motions of the soul towards and away from the fulfillment of desire. This is something that Roger Peterson, in his work on negative emotion, has I think made very clear, that there are positive emotions that express expectation or achievement, fulfillment of some kind of desire, whereas negative ones like fear, hatred, and resentment are fed more by a anxiety or a fear or a failure of being able to attain desire or anticipating its loss. Now, that might sound very schematic, but in fact, when you think of all the different ways one can anticipate or positively expect or fulfill a desire, and all the ways that that desire might be thwarted, it's actually quite complicated. And so it's a broad framework that I think is very flexible for understanding emotion. And like positive emotions, negative ones can vary greatly in intensity. They can be, as Sean Nye has called them, ugly feelings, ignoble expressions of pique, such as envy, or they can be all-consuming fears that are jealousies, animosities, and outbursts of fury. Hatred is an alloy of negative emotions. Like an alloy, it is more durable and enduring than its component parts. It is also qualitatively different, as Aaron Halpern has argued. While anger, for example, is focused on the actions of target objects, anger is an expression of an unfulfilled need out of a momentary event. Something happens and you get angry. Fear is based on anticipated consequences of an event, but hatred is exclusively focused on the object itself, the object of hatred, as opposed to, say, the event or the moment. So you have long-term grievances over perceived wrongdoing, resentments against perceived social inequities, and senses of constant threat feed a desire to separate oneself from the other, or to remove that other from one's midst, or even to annihilate the other, wherever they can be found. The hated object is perceived as noxious, dangerous, or in theological terms, evil. Love breaks down boundaries. Hatred hardens and preserves them. As a cognitive routine, it anchors an individual's sense of selfhood and attachment to a community. That is, there is a socially constructive function of hatred, as Dan Smale has written of medieval French communities, where hatred was a form of social capital, because taking upon oneself a pre-existing intracommunal hatred integrated yourself into the community. It provided them an economic social network. So hatred can actually have a kind of social integrative function. The hater and the hated are thus bound together, and the former depends upon the latter just as much as does the lover upon the beloved. In other words, the hater can't really survive without the hated object, and the lover can't survive without the loved object. And of course, the object that one hates can also be the object that one loves, and vice versa, as Catullus put it 2,000 years ago, odi et amor, odi et amo, I hate and I love Why I do ask this, perhaps you ask, I know not, but I feel it happening and I am tortured. Now that's an expression of individual emotion. 2 millennia later, the Zionist publicist Nachum Sokolov actually wrote about this as well in the 1930s, that hatred has a subtle relation with love. We hate only those who possess affinity. Human hatred is a passion for physical and spiritual adjustments, which, not knowing how to fulfill itself in love towards its own kind, tries to break through to success by means of assault, bribery, and war. The language is a bit fractured, but this is actually the language of the book. It was written in English, and his English was pretty good, but perhaps not perfect. But you get the point that hatred as a political emotion is very much tied to a sense that there is a group of people who you think you can't live with, but in a way you can't do without them, because you need them to help you identify yourself. So what I'm going to be doing now is exploring these physical and spiritual adjustments expected by those who hate Zionism and those who hate in Zionism's name. So my talk today is really going to be very much about hatred and 2 kinds of Zionism, 2 kinds of hatred, actually. So I'm going to start with the whole notion of hating Zionism. And I'm going to begin with the kind of hatred of Zionism that comes from hating Jews. You hate Jews and then you hate Zionism. Today, there are raging public debates whether anti-Zionism is a form of anti-Semitism. But one could just as well ask whether anti-Semitism is routinely anti-Zionist, and if it is, why? What is it about Zionism that is so loathsome or fearsome in an anti-Semite's imagination? So there's a very interesting history about the way anti-Semites have approached Zionism that has been, I think, neglected. That when the Zionist movement first began in the 80s and 90s, it was sometimes viewed with favor by anti-Semites in Europe, for example, because they saw it as a way to get Jews out of Europe. For example, Edouard Drumont was very sympathetic to Zionism and thought the first Zionist Congress of 1897 was a great thing. But more common was a view that Zionism simply could not be. It was impossible. As Eugen Döring, in his vicious anti-Semitic book of 1892 on the Jewish question, wrote, I don't believe that the Jews, were they to unite in a territory, would be prevented, or I do not believe that they would be prevented from renewing their obtrusive nomadism. In other words, Jews are a nomadic people. They can't be anything else. Without it and alone among themselves, they would eat one another alive, for other peoples would not be among them. A Jewish state would mean the destruction of the Jews by the Jews. So in other words, it just can't happen. Houston Stewart Chamberlain wrote something similar around 1900. He wrote that it is impossible to renew the Hebrew language. It just can't happen because the Jews have no creative capacity. Jews cannot labor. So therefore, anything happening in Palestine at the time simply was not happening because it could not happen. There was a definite shift in European anti-Semitic beliefs about Zionism after World War I, with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, the establishment of the British mandate over Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. This confirmed all of the anti-Semites' worst fears, that the power of the Jews to actually remap the global geopolitical system was actually coming to date. So, for example, we see here, this is Döring, and this is from around 1920, and this is in a posthumously published edition of the same book that he'd written in 1892. He talks about the grave threat presented by Zionism that needs to push history back, make necessary something like a second Roman, what he called clearing action, basically like the Roman response to the Jewish revolt of 66 to 73 CE. And it would be brought to an end in an entirely different and far more comprehensive sense. In other words, he's basically calling for genocide against the Jews. And this notion that a Jewish concentration in Palestine was not trivial, but was actually quite destructive and threatening, was common among anti-Semites of the interwar era. As Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf, endowed with sovereign rights and removed from the intervention of other states, a Jewish state would become a haven for convicted scoundrels and a university for budding crooks. In the United States, this view had quite a hearing in The International Jew, which was a series of more than 100 articles written for Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. And these articles are often explained as a kind of paraphrase of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. I would say it's more of a palimpsest, because there's actually a lot of material in it that is not in the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, although it reflects their spirit. The text was written almost entirely by a totally unknown man named William Cameron, who was a dipsomaniac journalist from Ontario, a graduate of the University of Toronto, I'm sorry to say, and who went to work for Ford and wrote anti-Semitic screeds, in which he wrote that Zionism represented the worst conflation of Bolshevism and of capitalism, and was part of the great Jewish world conspiracy to manipulate Britain for its own loathsome needs. So what we have then is a notion in pre-World War II anti-Semitism, interwar anti-Semitism, is that Zionism is not peripheral. It is something seen as terrifically dangerous and hateful. Now, after 1945, or more particularly after 1948, many of these themes continued. For example, here we see in the Soviet and the East Bloc, communist ideology preserved older tropes of Jewish nomadism and rootlessness under the rubric of cosmopolitanism. Ironically, though, this cosmopolitanism implied parochialism and loyalty to the capitalist West, as well as international Jewry, the latter centered in the state of Israel. And in the United States, anti-Semites made the opposite accusation, that Zionism was evil because it was an agent of communism. In 1964, the far-right John Birch Society described Israel as having been established to serve the interests of the Kremlin and being, quote, 50 to 70% under communist control, run by a clique of socialists clinging to power and imposing catastrophic economic policies. Now, most anti-Semites in the West had the Cold War on their minds, but some still harped on the imperial conflicts of the early 20th century. In 1985, a lawyer and writer named Robert St. John published in the Journal of Historical Review, which is a front for Holocaust denial, a lengthy and densely footnoted article documenting and accusing Zionists of having pushed the United States into World War I. He even went so far as to say that Jews in America blackmailed Woodrow Wilson over an alleged adulterous love affair, pressured him to appoint the Zionist Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. Brandeis pressured Wilson to declare war on Germany. And then Chaim Weizmann enters this article threatening to smash the British Empire as we smashed the Russian Empire should Wilson not support Zionism. So this conflation then of Zionism with global Jewish conspiracy is very well entrenched. Now, there was a change in anti-Semitic approaches to Zionism in the 1980s. Anti-Semitic language began to take on a new dimension, where writers on the far right began to use the word Zio as a pejorative for Jew. And at first it was connected with Nazi. So you see the term Zio-Nazi here. I just pulled this off of a Facebook page, a hostile reference to the state of Israel and its supporters. And what we can see is that although the term Zio-Nazi and Zio in a negative sense was originally from the right, it's now been picked up by people on the right and left alike. The use of the term was popularized by David Duke in the 1990s and early 2000s, former Grand Wizard of the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, member of the Louisiana State House of Representatives. Zio is frequently linked with a second noun or adjective. So in addition to Zio Nazi, we see Zio Marxist is very common, Zio Economics, Zio Media, Zio Feminists. In 2015, a Canadian anti-Semitic newspaper claimed that Prime Minister Stephen Harper had been, quote, co-opted by Canadian Zio-fascists with their eyes on turning Canada into a Zio-Marxist vassal state. So Zio-fascist and Zio-Marxist are all the same thing. And the newspaper went on to make all kinds of outrageous accusations that I won't go into at this time. Now, another path taken by anti-Semitic evaluations of Zionism since 1948 has been to embrace Israel by expressing ambivalence, if not hostility, at the same time towards diaspora Jews. In the 2000 teens and 20s, increasingly authoritarian regimes in Hungary and Poland produced whitewashed histories of their persecutions of Jews in World War II. Public figures accused Jews of collaboration with the post-war communist regimes and not being truly members of the nation. Traditional Catholic anti-Semitism continued to be expressed in Poland, but the regimes allegedly admired Israel for its commitment to ethno-nationalism, its reluctance to admit immigrants alien to the dominant people, and its military strength. A similar trend was visible in the United States, where the white nationalist, as he was called, or as he called himself, really a racist, Richard Spencer, supported the 2018 nation-state law of the State of Israel, calling it, quote, a path forward for Europeans. President Donald Trump flirted with anti-Semitism in public remarks about American Jews, but lent Israel unshakable support. He did this to please, or largely to please, evangelical Christians, whose proclaimed love for the Jewish people could conceal exasperation with Jews for not supporting Israel sufficiently and continuing to deny Jesus's divinity. In the most fervent forms of early 21st century evangelical Christianity, the phrase odi et amo, I love and I hate, could not have been more apt. In the aftermath of the 2021 election in Israel, the evangelical American leader Mike Evans, furious that Benjamin Netanyahu might be ousted from the premiership, harangued Netanyahu's opponents, and we see the quotation here, if they keep up this pathetic political striptease act, this theater of the absurd, I'll spend the rest of my life fighting them all, mobilizing millions of evangelicals to join me in the fight. I understand how the Holocaust happened. German Jews were busy insulting each other, drunk on the wine of pride. They did not see the smoke of Auschwitz rising because they were more Germans than Jews. Directly comparing Netanyahu's adversaries to the killers of Jesus, Evans added that, these would-be pretend striptease actors are screaming at the top of their lungs, crucify him, crucify him. It is sick and shameful to see such a group running like rabid dogs, possessed with power and revenge. What appreciation do you show us? You shit right on our face. How dare you? The boundary between love and hatred is fine indeed. So that's about then the hatred of Jews leading to hatred of Zionism. Sometimes it can get masked, but we see what lies underneath it. Now, another and more, I'd say, common phenomenon in the Western world in our own era is the question of the opposite direction. That is a hatred of Zionism that does or does not lead allegedly to a hatred of Jews. And this depends entirely on definitions and variables. If you define Zionism as the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, if you define Israel as central to contemporary Jewish life, second if. Third if, in your view, the only legitimate expression of Zionism is Jewish sovereignty and Jewish hegemony in the land of Israel, if you accept those three ifs, then someone who opposes Israel as a Jewish state is ipso facto an anti-Semite. On the other hand, the act of cementing diaspora Jews with Israel and arguing that all Jews do or must support the country in its current form opens Jews to accusations that they are responsible for Israel's actions. Now, in fact, in our own day, most American Jews, as survey data suggests, do feel emotionally attached to Israel. But the depth and the intensity and the valence of that attachment varies greatly. The same can be said, of course, for Jews within Israel itself. Now, attacks against Jews qua Jews because of assumptions about their bonds with Israel are clearly anti-Semitic. But what about verbal statements, as opposed to violence or harassment or intimidation, that target Israel alone? At what point does criticism become a sign of hatred? That's the emotion we're really thinking about. Is hatred always equivalent to hatred of Israel, always equivalent to hatred of Jews? Since 1948, hateful comments about Zionism and Israel have been commonplace, especially in the Arab Muslim worlds and Muslim worlds, as well as we saw just a moment ago, the communist bloc, former communist bloc. In leftist circles, or in current parlance, progressive circles, in Europe and North America, hostility to Israel has intensified in the wake of the Second Intifada from 2000 and violent confrontations between Israel and Hamas in Gaza Strip, going back to 2008, 9, 2012, 2014, 2021. Heightened racial tensions in the United States during the Trump administration and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States intensified sympathies with racialized minorities and oppressed indigenous peoples worldwide, especially Palestinians. And during and after the Gaza violence of May of 2021, thousands of academics endorsed harsh critiques of Israel and statements of solidarity with Palestinians. So the Palestine in Praxis petition that was signed by many hundreds, actually, of academics. And then just most recently, the Harvard Crimson editorial board issued an editorial in support of the boycott and divestment sanctions movement. The movement itself has ambiguous goals and methods. One thing is clear is that the Israeli government and mainstream Jewish organizations have reacted to this movement with alarm, seeing it as the latest chapter in an unrelenting quest by Israel's enemies to destroy the state of Israel. And even if they're somewhat uncomfortable with Israel's oppression of Palestinians, mainstream Jewish organizations in the diaspora tend to identify BDS with anti-Semitic hatred. Now, its achievements have been meager, but the BDS movement has so unnerved the Israeli government that in 2017, it enacted legislation denying entry into the country of boycott activists, even those who would limit the boycott, say, to products and services produced within the occupied territories. In July of 2021, when Ben & Jerry's ice cream announced it would no longer sell its products in the West Bank, we had reactions like this. So we see people who associate the Ben & Jerry's act with Nazism, Judenrein flavored ice cream, or anti-Sement, which is BDS, BS, it looks like poop. I mean, there's all kinds of lot going on there in these images. Also in the claim by Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, that this boycott or this really session to sell ice cream in the territories was, quote, economic terrorism. Yet Yair Lapid, Israel's foreign minister, called it a shameful surrender to anti-Semitism. Now, such responses suggest that any speech or action that would compel Israel to alter its policies or its character is tantamount to an effort to destroy the country and the people within it. Therefore, it's hateful, therefore it's anti-Semitic. There are two problems with this argument. One is that anti-Semitism is an irrational hostility or hatred of Jews. Can there be a rational base behind hatred? Here we see, by the way, just another question of reacting to the BDS editorial at Harvard. Already people are calling on Jews to give money to fight against what they see as a vicious and hateful campaign against Israel. Well, the first question I want to ask, and I'm really interested in your comments, is hatred ever rational? After all, Israel's creation led directly to the forced flight or the expulsion of almost 2/3 of the Arabs who lived in historic Palestine. Israel's, the territories it has occupied since 1967 are home to millions of Palestinians who live under occupation, subject to violent aggression by Israeli armed forces and settlers, land confiscation, and daily humiliation. Over 5 million Palestinians live as refugees in countries surrounding Israel. The hatred that victims feel towards their victimizers may be all-consuming and destructive, but do we place rational hatred in the same conceptual framework as irrational hatred? That's a question. And I'm actually asking that question with one person in mind. Israel's legendary chief of staff, defense secretary, Moshe Dayan. In 1956, he delivered a eulogy for a young Israeli man from Tel Aviv who had gone to Gaza to live on a kibbutz and who was killed in a border raid. And in the eulogy, Dayan took Arab hatred for granted, but he found it neither irrational nor misplaced. As he said, let us not hurl blame at the murderers. Why should we complain of their hatred for us? 8 years they have sat in the refugee camps in Gaza and seen with their own eyes how we have made a homeland of the soil and the villages where they and their forebears once dwelt. Now, this putative empathy is actually a form of condescension. It makes blanket assumptions about an essentialized enemy. But the point I'm saying is Dayan is not accusing Palestinian Arabs of being anti-Semitic. He's saying they hate us and they hate us with good reason. This leads to a second concern about conflating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Although hatred and anger overlap, they're not always congruent. That is, you can be angry with someone and not necessarily hate them. Hatred attributes not only wrongdoing, but also malevolence to the hated party. I said that at the beginning of my talk, that anger deals with evenemental, it deals with problems of the moment, it deals with situational issues, whereas hatred is something much more petrified. Hatred is based on malevolence. It feeds desires to be rid of the other altogether. Angratory is more transitory, and hatred is enduring. Anger over the oppression of Palestinians and the denial of their rights of self-determination or security or dignity can certainly be bound up with hatred of Israel. And that hatred can assume murderous and even genocidal dimensions. There are people who hate Israel, who want to destroy it, who want to kill the people who live there. But anger could also be free of expressions of willful promotion of hatred, even if that anger is disturbing and passionate and is a source of concern for people who identify with Israel. So is our anger and hatred the same? What stands out about the Palestinian cause is not the emotions of those at its center. That is, we understand why Palestinian Arabs and why Israeli Jews feel the way they do about each other. We might not agree, we might want them to feel differently, but at least we can understand why they feel the way they do. But what's odd is the intensity of feeling of outside observers. That is, people who know and care very little about oppressed peoples throughout the world, have passionate feelings about Israel-Palestine. Even the language used to describe the Israel-Palestine struggle is unique. For example, in English and German, the term right to exist, it enjoyed some currency in the 19th century. Then after World War I, it showed up a bit in terms of stateless European peoples, but its usage really spiked from the 1970s and then really went up after 2000. And if you look at dictionary definitions of the term, and it's almost always identified with Israel. I'll show you here. This is really interesting. If you look on Linguet.com, which uses phrases, from literature and then shows you their translation into English. So if you look at the term Existenzrecht, it's almost always about the state of Israel. So if you're reading in German, Existenzrecht, it means Israel's right to exist. So what's going on here? The intensity of awareness and passion. Well, of course, anti-Semitism plays a role, but as I always tell my students, there's more going on. The legacy of colonialism, Israel's location in a territory venerated by half of humanity or 40% of humanity. And as I've written, if Israel had been founded as a Christian state by Protestant enthusiasts as a Latter-day Crusader kingdom, and the same fate had befallen Palestine's Arabs, hostility towards a Christian Zionist state would be at least as great as hostility to Israel today. In fact, it would probably be more widely hated if it were a Christian state, because the connection with Western colonialism would be even more explicit, and it could not appeal to the conscience of humanity as the vehicle of rebirth of a people destroyed or decimated during the Holocaust. So we have a real affective complexity, the need to distinguish anger from hatred and hostility to Jews from other sources of negative attention. And this is unfortunately simply not addressed in the most widely accepted definition of anti-Semitism in the international community, issued by the European Union's Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia in 2005, and endorsed in 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This definition claims that applying double standards by requiring of Israel behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation is anti-Semitic. Fine, but no other democratic nation is currently defined by the international community as an occupation power, as an occupying power. The definition also considers it anti-Semitic to call Israel a racist endeavor, or Zionism a racist endeavor. But given that the nation-state law of 2018 claims that only Jews have a right of self-determination in Israel, and given the subaltern, subordinate, oppressed status of Arabs within the occupied territories and the institutionalized discrimination against Arab citizens of Israel, it is not hateful. It is not hateful to see in Israel, as per the Oxford English Dictionary definition of racism, to see in this country, quote, the presence of, and I'm just quoting from the dictionary definition, prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group. So in sum, Negative conceptions of Israel can be catalyzed by or elicit hatred, but they can also be tied up with other emotions, such as disappointment, frustration, or anger, that when blended with positive emotions, such as hope and sympathy, could stimulate meliorative actions directed not at destroying Israel so much as reforming it. I think a good deal of the rather murky critique of Israel that comes from Jews who identify in one form or another as connected with Israel, but who are very critical, it lies in this ground of a mixture of disappointment, frustration, and anger, but tinged also with hope and sympathy. So far I've been talking about people who hate Zionism, but what about when Zionism begins to hate? To paraphrase the title of a wonderful book about Polish nationalism by Brian Porter. To those who feel oppressed or victimized or threatened, hatred is a noble emotion. It anchors personal identity. It defines the self in terms of another. I said this at the beginning, and I want to elaborate a bit, that a person living in a state of economic or political insecurity may be nonetheless ontologically secure, practicing cognitive routines in which the enemy, who is ever present, is a source of psychic strength. There's a term called ontological security that's gained some traction in international relations. Hatred provides a sense of purpose, and it compensates for perceived wrongs by instilling a yearning for revenge. Hatred elevates the humiliated. Hatred dignifies the dishonored. In the wake of the Kishinev pogrom of 1903, Chaim Nachman Bialik wrote poems brimming with anger and despair. And his condemnation of revenge against the Jews' tormentors revealed just how tempted he and his readers were to embrace it. And the Holocaust, in later decades, wiped away those inhibitions to frank expressions of hatred, so that you get to the point by the post-World War II era where Jews, Jewish artists, writers, novelists, and so forth, poets, are capable now of expressing hatred in an overt form that they had they'd felt inhibited from expressing before. The best example being the poet Uri Tzvi Greenberg in a very powerful Hebrew poem, "We were not likened to dogs among the Gentiles. We were not led like sheep to the slaughter in the boxcars, for like leprous sheep, they led us to extinction. They did not push the sheep into the fire to make ash of the living and to scatter the ashes over streams and sewers." I mean, this is a poem that aestheticizes hatred. Similarly, Abba Kovner, who Holocaust survivor and ghetto leader, did more than declaim hatred for Gentiles. This partisan leader of the Vilna ghetto resistance during the war, he spent the later years of the war hunting down German soldiers and local collaborators, even planning to kill 6 million Germans by poisoning the water supply of major German cities. The scheme didn't happen. He wound up poisoning bread, I think, in a prisoner of war camp. But the important issue is that after World War II and the establishment of the State of Israel, people like Greenberg or Kovner, they were Zionists. Greenberg on the right and Kovner on the left. During the 1948 war, Kovner directed his hatred of Gentiles onto Arabs. He wrote propaganda pamphlets for the IDF, whose savagery and bloodlust was off-putting even to hardened IDF commanders. Zionist attitudes towards Arabs were usually more complex than Kovner's unhinged fury, and they reflected the colonial as well as the national aspects of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm going to say something counterintuitive here. In a colonial setting, there is room in the mind of the newcomer for paternalism, admiration, and respect for the native, as well as fear, disregard, and contempt. In a nationality conflict, the range of feelings between the groups is different. It can move from friendship, comity, and conviviality to rivalries, resentments, and hatreds based on shifting legal and socioeconomic status. In 1948 in Palestine, we see a mingling of the two models. But I think that after Israel's establishment, you begin to get more and more of the national variety and less of the colonial variety, even though Israel's post-1948 history is often depicted solely by critics of Israel in colonial terms. Ironically, the more colonial attitude was the pre-1948 attitude. Pre-1948 Zionist rhetoric about Arabs could be hostile without being hateful. In the early 20th century, the death of Jewish settlers at the hands of Arabs was a cause for anger and public mourning, but not for vengeance. Vladimir Jabotinsky's iconic essay from 1923 on the Iron Wall urged an uncompromising militance in the face of Arab opposition, but he says that opposition is rational and commanding of respect. In Jabotinsky's final book from 1940, The Jewish War Front, Jabotinsky maintained that once Arabs give up their dreams of an Arab Palestine, they should enjoy complete equality in the Jewish state, even to proportional sharing by Jews of Arabs, power sharing basically in the government, and a kind of rotation, or not rotation, but parity between ministers and deputy ministers from the different nationalities. Now, Menachem Begin, who claimed Jabotinsky's mantle as the leader of revisionist Zionism, had different views, and they were affectively different. Jabotinsky was a forceful and passionate man, but he rarely displayed the fears and resentments and hatreds common among the oppressed. Begin, on the other hand, was both buffeted and formed by hatred. Hatred of the Nazis who killed his family, hatred of Stalinism, which he experienced, whose cruelties he experienced firsthand as a prisoner in a Soviet jail and labor camp. What's interesting is Begin did not transfer his hatred of the Nazis or Stalin. He didn't transfer his hatred onto Arabs. He transferred it to the British as commander of the Irgun Tzva'i Leumi from 1944. And we see this in his memoir, The Revolt, from 1951. And what he's writing about is, again, as I said at the beginning of this section, an ennobling hatred, a hatred of a colonized people against its oppressor that unites and gives them dignity and a sense of honor. As he writes, we have to hate. And the hatred, we have to hate. Hate is it's axiomatic. We hate first and foremost. What do we hate? We hate our condition, right? We hate the humiliating disgrace and homelessness of our people. We have to hate. We had to hate the barring of the gates of our country to our own brethren. So we have to hate the British. If you love freedom, you must hate slavery. If you love your people, you cannot but hate the enemies that compass your destruction. Simply put, if you love, you must hate. And so this is an ennobling kind of emotion. Hating Britain was honorable, placed Zionism in the company of the freedom fighters of the world. And we see knock-on effects of this in a wonderful memoir that Amos Oz published in the early 90s, I think, called Panther, in the late 90s, early 90s, called Panther in the Basement, where he describes himself as a 12-year-old boy, part of a make-believe anti-British underground that's building a rocket to destroy Buckingham Palace. And the whole idea of this novelette or novella is that they must hate Britain. It's part of their identity. And the problem is that the Amos Oz character forms a friendship with a British officer. So these feelings are of ennobling hatred. And I think they're very different from the outbursts of intercommunal violence that began in Mandate Palestine as early as 1920, began 1920-21, much worse in 1929. In other words, outright rage. Hillel Cohen's written about this for 1929. And in 1948, there was widespread killing on both sides of civilians, expulsions, massacres, feeding off of reservoirs of fear, hatred, utter disregard for the humanity of the enemy. I think hatred and anger are actually very different from rage. This is something that Roger Peterson writes about. Rage is something that simply overcomes an individual. And soldiers are not necessarily encouraged to be enraged in battle because the enraged soldier might go off the rails and not obey commands. So the IDF actually had a problem during the 1948 war, encouraging its soldiers to feel what they called a rational hatred that would restrain them from committing atrocities, but the atrocities happened nonetheless. And a lot of this notion of what rage is and how rage cannot be neatly conflated into hatred was pioneered in this wonderful book on the history of anger and rage that came out actually pretty early in the development of the field of the history of emotions. Hatred and rage have political value. The first, like controlled fission in a nuclear plant, is a source of political power, but the second is more like a thermonuclear explosion, and it can destroy the regime that deploys it. And so what happens in Israel after 1948, as in many states in the post-World War II order, is that you have multinational states that have been the sites of internecine killing, and they have to become more circumspect about fomenting political hatred. So here we see an ideal of post-war comity, what is called in Serbo-Croatian brotherhood and unity. Brotherhood and unity, which in Israel, and I don't have the image right here, but there's a great picture from 1955 of the mayor of Nazareth with the Moshe Sharet, and the two of them together are, standing or sitting together in a kind of, again, in a congenial expression of coexistence. So in Israel, scores of thousands of Israeli Jews bore the knowledge of what they had done during the war, but the instruments of official memory, the state, the educational system, the means of mass communication, presented a sanitized version of the war, denying not only the violence wrought by the Jews against Palestinians, but also the hatred and rage behind it. Now, this is a really important concept that was developed by a Turkish scholar named Fatma Müge Göçek, who's written in her study of Turkish violence against Armenians. She notes that all states are founded in episodes of collective violence, and that denial of violence is central to the founding of the state. And the closer that the observer is to that founding moment, then the more intense the level of denial. So for Göçek, Turkish denial of the Armenian genocide is indicative of fear that the state is alone, struggling for survival in a hostile world. The response to that insecurity is to deny or minimize the violence, blame the enemy, or claim it was unavoidable. I summarize the approach as, we didn't do it. It wasn't that bad. It was their fault. We had no choice, and everybody else was doing it. So this multi-level notion of denying acts of atrocities. And I believe that Göçek's observations apply as well to Israel's denial of the Nakba. And it can be done through various ways. One can minimize the numbers. Most common numbers are 700 to 750,000. Israeli governmental sources in the 1950s would say 550,000. In Israeli official memory, the Palestinians fled of their own accord or were compelled by Arab commanders to leave their homes. Now, in those cases where evidence of expulsion is irrefutable, then in Israeli official memory, it is presented as regrettable, isolated, and justified as an act of military necessity. And it's contextualized, so placed in the context of global population movement, expulsion, and refugee creation in the years after 1945. A denial of hatred accompanies the denial of violence. By the mid-20th century, it had become ignoble in political rhetoric for a dominant majority to hate a minority. It happened, but regimes that conceived of themselves or wished to be perceived as liberal needed to deny such feelings. In the young state of Israel, there was palpable fear and hostility towards Arab states, especially Egypt. Palestinian transborder infiltrators, most of whom were unarmed peasants, although some were armed, and Arab citizens of Israel as well were seen as objects of fear. But hatred of the country's Arabs was not expressed in the country's radio station, in its newspapers, in its school books. Arabs were talked about in neutral terms. The language employed by the state of Israel in the 50s and 60s spoke of Arab refugees, the abandoned Arab villages, the Arab minority, Hamiut Ha'aravi. Jews and Arabs in Israeli public discourse simply did not hate each other, as in post-war Yugoslavia, which simply denied the long-term history of tensions and hatreds between Serbs and Croats, and Serbs in particular against Bosnian Muslims. Now, as we saw with Begin, love of one's own community can justify hatred of its enemies. As the cultural theorist Sarah Ahmed has argued, declaration of love makes it possible to deny hatred altogether. Acts of self-preservation may require the use of intimidation or force, presented as an inevitable consequence of love. The best example of this, this was out of place, sorry. There we saw the expression of comity between the Prime Minister, Moshe Sharet, and Amin Gargora of Nazareth. Anyway, hatred simply being denied, we talked about minimizing it, rationalizing it, but another way of denying hatred is to displace it by saying, I don't hate, I love. Or as Meir Kahane, the firebrand American rabbi, said in the 1960s and 70s, I don't hate Arabs, I love Jews. The foundational principles of his Jewish Defense League were love of Jewry, dignity and pride, and so on. And after moving to Israel in 1971, Kahane's thought became darker, apocalyptic, and more militant. And as much as he hated secular Jews, he hated Gentiles more, associating the non-Jewish world as a whole with the Holocaust. Now, although he expressed hatred of Gentiles in general, he did express particular hatred of Arabs. And in 1980, while serving a jail sentence for planning to attack Palestinians, he wrote a book called They Must Go, which justifies a mass expulsion of Arabs because he claims Arabs hate Jews. Therefore, it's not hatred of Arabs. He says it's an act of self-defense. It's an act of love. Kahane pretends to respect Arabs in language similar to that of Jabotinsky. He accuses liberal Zionists of contempt for Arab steadfastness, but in fact, he writes about Arabs in hostile and racist and truly hateful language. And we see here a kind of classic employment of racist fears of miscegenation in the United States between blacks and whites. The sexual crimes committed by Arabs against Jewish women are derived from both the usual sickness and one might call the Black Panther leader Eldridge Cleaver phenomenon of attacking and degrading the enemy. The more the Arabs multiply and reach Jewish areas, the greater will be the number of general crimes and sexual ones. So in fact, he's quite hateful, but he's expressing it as a form of love and self-defense. Now, it was this kind of notion that the Arab is a demographic threat, a sexual threat, a racial threat, but also an existential theological threat, preventing the attainment of a messianic kingdom, which Kahane believed in and some of his followers believed in. This is what led to things like the Temple Mount plot of the 1980s, or the mass murder of Arabs in Hebron on Purim in 1994 by Baruch Goldstein. And over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, small neo-Kahanist parties have advocated for the transfer of Arabs from Israel and against the presence of African asylum seekers in the country. Founded in 2005, the organization Lahava, or Flame, campaigns against social or intimate interactions between Jews and non-Jews and Israel, protesting marriages between Jews and Arabs. The neo-Kahanist party, Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power, now sits in the Knesset with a single representatives. Now, one might say, so what? These are, small splinter groups. They are hateful indeed, but they do not represent anything beyond a small minority. Well, I'm not sure. After all, during the second and after the second Intifada of 2000 to 2005, this kind of rhetoric became more mainstream, as we see notoriously from Benjamin Netanyahu's Facebook page in 2015. The right is in danger of losing power. The Arab voters are moving in droves to the voting stations. But this is just, maybe one utterance. But what of the calls of death to Arabs that became increasingly common in political demonstrations and at soccer games involving Arab teams in the 2010s, where one Beitar Jerusalem fan boasted after a game, Gizanut zo arachim, racism is a value. There's been abundant survey data, many surveys done over the last 20 years of Israeli Jewish attitudes towards Arabs. And I don't think it is at all an exaggeration to say they're extremely hostile. A 1999 study, 77% of Israeli Jews opposed sexual relations between Arabs and Jews. 1999, 77%. 56% opposed granting Arabs equal social rights. This includes Arab citizens of Israel. 21st century survey data seems to continue this. Data from 2003 to 2009. A third of Israeli Jews do not feel, quote, ready to have an Arab friend. Half don't want an Arab neighbor. 15 to 20% claim that they were actually insulted or threatened by an Arab, but between 60 and 70% claim that Arabs present a demographic threat. Only 2/3 of Israeli Jews polled in the early 2000 teens thought that Arabs should be allowed to vote for the Knesset. Only a third felt that Arabs should be allowed to purchase land where they wish. In 2016, about half of Israeli Jews agreed that Arabs should be expelled or transferred from Israel. The support for expulsion was 71% among Jews who identify as national religious. In 2018, 90% of Jewish respondents objected to their daughter befriending an Arab boy, with almost as many objecting to their son befriending an Arab girl. More than a third were bothered by the fact that half of Israel's pharmacists are Arabs. And a survey of Israeli teenagers in 2021 found that 66% of ultra-Orthodox Jews expressed fear or hatred of Arabs. And Jewish and Arab hatred are reciprocal. That is, the same surveys have also revealed considerable Arab hostility to Jews, in fact, even more intense than Jewish animosity to Arabs. In that 2021 survey I mentioned a moment ago, Arab teens have negative attitudes about secular Jews, religious Zionist Jews, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and the timing of the survey overlapped with growing numbers of clashes between Jewish and Arab youths in downtown West Jerusalem and Jerusalem's Old City. The Israel-Gaza violence in May of 2021 sparked violent altercations between Jews and Arabs in mixed communities throughout Israel, with much more violence by Arabs against Jews than the other way around, although it did happen. Now, the government's response is telling and gets us back to the beginning of my talk. It conflated Arab violence against Jews within Israel with the thousands of rockets fired by Hamas at Israeli cities. Rather than acknowledge the structural reasons behind Israeli-Arab fury, such as longstanding social and economic grievance, lack of access to land for housing, inadequate social services, and so on, government figures responded as if they were the true victims. The president of Israel referred to the burning of synagogues in Lod as a pogrom committed by a bloodthirsty Arab mob, and the mayor of Lod, on the left here, compared the arson to Kristallnacht. The prime minister himself said that the destruction, quote, reminds us of scenes from our people's past. The justice minister said there were times when Jews were defenseless and powerless against their attackers. Thank God those times have passed. And Israelis in 2021 had every reason to fear missiles falling all around them. But fear and self-pity in the face of violence committed against Israel allowed for a minimization, a rationalization, and a transfer of responsibility for Israel's own acts, the blurring of lines between aggression and self-defense, and the denial of widespread anti-Arab hatred. Such bundling of negative emotions is quite common in deeply divided societies. Now, to conclude, how widely are these feelings shared among society's diasporas? Well, we don't have the same kind of survey data, say for American Jewish attitudes towards Arabs in Israel or the occupied territories that we have for Israeli Jews. What we do know is that American Jews do tend to be consistently more dovish than Israelis regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. A major survey conducted in 2020 showed that the vast majority of non-Orthodox American Jews, for example, believe in the possibility of an enduring two-state solution. Only a minority of non-Orthodox Jews believe that Israel is doing enough to pursue peace. Now, these figures suggest a certain level of sympathy and respect, feelings that don't usually coexist with hatred. The fact that American Orthodox Jews are considerably less likely to share such optimism or to criticize the Israeli government's policies jives with my analysis in a previous chapter in the book, that the Orthodox affective connection with Israel is a confident and firm emotional connection that is undiminished by and perhaps quite supportive of Israel's treatment of Palestinian Arabs within Israel and in the territories. To the extent that neo-Kahanist hatred of Arabs exists within the American Jewish community, it's more common among Orthodox than among non-Orthodox. Now, that said, in Israel and in the diaspora, Orthodox Jews demonstrate a range of feelings towards Arabs, from hateful contempt to humanitarian and hierarchical paternalism to unalloyed sympathy and respect. And such a spectrum is likely to exist throughout the Jewish world. So to sum up in a paragraph, hatred can penetrate all forms of Jewish self-ascription. The affective pathogens, the fears, the frustrated desires, the accumulated memories of past wrongs that are responsible for anti-Semitism's most virulent variants also produce Arabophobia and Islamophobia. The difference between Zionism and anti-Semitism is not that one is free from hatred and the other is synonymous with it. All nationalisms can be cruel and exclusionary, and Zionism is no exception. But national identifications can also be inspirational and inculcate a yearning for achievement and solidarity. Now, anti-Semitism can provide emotional satisfaction in that it accounts for personal or collective failures and limitations, but its therapeutic powers are feeble unless it is stoked into a frenzy, the consequences of which are disastrous. So nationalisms can, of course, have all kinds of negative qualities, affective qualities. They can also have positive ones, whereas something like anti-Semitism is simply a form of hatred. Hatred has a socio-biological rationale in that it promotes in-group solidarity, it inhibits exogamy, it justifies violence against proven or potential enemies of the community. But like the body's immune system, the emotional culture of a society can become hyperactive, weakening the body politic by attacking its own members or external elements that in fact don't present a substantial or existential threat. In an asymmetrical conflict, the stronger party's hatreds do greater harm to the weaker party than the other way around, but the stronger party does damage itself as well as the enemy. And I wonder, as I speak these lines, if there is any sign that most Israeli Jews or their diaspora counterparts have internalized this lesson. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek, for this provocative and depressing talk. I will start with a few questions that comments. Some of my colleagues in the early modern workshop know that I was an emo skeptic, that is, skeptic of the history of emotions and the role. But I think although you only gave us one snippet of the hatred, which is the most kind of depressing emotion, is very compelling in terms of thinking about a history of a political movement through these various emotions, and I have to say that's something that gives a lot of food for thought. So before I actually turn to especially the sort of discussion about hatred as a political emotion, which I think is a kind of encapsulates what you were talking about, I want to just, if you could tell us briefly about the other emotions in the history of Zionism that you are addressing, again, to take me off the Emma skepticism, which I think I'm no longer.
Yeah, look, I think that like any, historians tend to, like everybody else, be trendy and to follow fads. And I'm resolutely anti-faddish. But I think that the methodology of the history of emotions is extremely useful. And I would never call myself a historian of emotion. I'm a historian who finds this methodology interesting. And so I've added it to my toolkit. And I've written a book about Zionism through the lens of emotion. That doesn't mean everything else is missing. My next book will be methodologically rather different. So, but to answer your question, the fundamental emotion that I actually begin with are the various emotions that bind people together. So emotions of solidarity, compassion, love, broadly understood. And I published an article a couple of years ago called What's Love Got to Do with It? The Emotional Bases of Early Zionism, where I talk about a kind of a sentimental love, mid-19th century romantic sentimental love, which is really what the Chibat Zion movement, the Love of Zion movement, is all about. It's why they even use the word Chiba and not the word Ahava. The word Chiba really has a sentimental meaning. I talk about the effect of the translation of Daniel Deronda into Hebrew and the effect it had on the Jewish public, the writings of the Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, who was just steeped in romantic, sentimental national love. And this really kept the Zionist movement going until either just before or just after World War I, when the dimensions of love become much more vigorous and outright erotic. You get the kind of love of the transforming Zionist body, usually coded as male, but sometimes female, the kibbutz, the moshav, the transformation of the land. It becomes much more tactile and erotic during the interwar period and beyond. But so the first chapter of my emotion section is really about this kind of sentimental love transforming itself more into a kind of an erotic love. And then the following chapter, which deals with the period up to from 48 to the present, talks about romance, not in the sense of courtship, but the literary concept of a romance, which is a constant struggle between the pathos and joy, right? Like a Shakespearean romance. To understand diaspora Jewish emotional attitudes towards Israel, it's a constant roller coaster of love and attraction and excitement and euphoria. And people go to Israel, and like I've got the weirdest collection of evidence for this chapter. Itineraries from youth groups to Israel and popular cultural representations of Israel. But then, of course, there's the constant fear and anxiety that Israel is threatened, whether it's in 48 or 56 or 67 or 73. It's a constant emotional roller coaster that has all the trappings of romance. And so I traced that through, and then how I show how in the 90s it began to collapse, ironically, with the Oslo peace process. And as one American Jewish activist said, we need to keep on raising for money for Israel, even if they burn it, because the only thing that keeps us really alive as an American Jewish community is our support for Israel. And if we don't think that if Israel is no longer in crisis and doesn't need our financial support, we as American Jews will dry up. So they needed to continue, and of course, with the Second Intifada, fortunately for American Jews, the sense of crisis came back. So that's the emotional mix that constitutes the second chapter in that section. Then I've got my own favorite chapter in the book is the one that follows, which is called Between Gratitude and Betrayal. And it's about Zionism in the international community and the tremendous dependence of a client political entity on a patron. And thus the gushing gratitude that Zionism felt towards the great powers before and after World War I, and how that gratitude turns into the deepest and darkest betrayal during the 1930s and 40s towards Britain. And then in time towards the United States, because of alleged lack of American support for Israel, which is odd when you think of the extent to which the United States has supported Israel, but the power of these emotional expressions in the field of international relations. So I really like that chapter because it has kind of an IR perspective, although it's grounded quite heavily in primary sources. And then the final chapter is this one on hatred, with an epilogue called Against Hope, very much a critique of Yerushalmi's essay on Jewish hope, because I argue, as Hannah Arendt does, that hope can encourage all kinds of unrealistic thinking, and that Zionism at its most successful was based on every emotion except hope. It was based on determination.
But Hatikva is the national item.
Exactly. And Hatikva, I think, is a great case of false consciousness. I write about this in one of the chapters of the book, that tikvatenu or Hatikva is an expression of passive yearning, just sitting around waiting. Hatikva, bat shnot alpayim liot am choshi b'artzeinu. And when you read the actual multi-stanza poem by Naftali Hertz-Imber, it's just Jews sitting around, crying, weeping, and doing nothing. Well, that's not what Zionism was about. It was a purposeful movement of people who were determined to accomplish things. Whether they were cruel or heroic or whatever is not the issue. I think of it as false consciousness, that even to this day, we have people singing a national anthem about yearning and destruction and passivity. It reminds me a little bit of your native country's national anthem. Poland is not yet lost. Well, that was 1772 or whatever. It's been a while, right? So,
well, just before I move to the next question, the little anecdote in Beersheva, when I was on Sabbatic in Beersheva, the street that's called Tikva, Rehov Tikva, or Hatikva, I forget, is a little dead end street. So I don't know whether you want to use it.
I like that. Tikva, mavui satum. I like
so,
that. Yeah.
But it's interesting that you read Bialik through the lens of hatred. I always read Bialik through the lens of anger.
Mm-hmm.
So where does anger become hatred? Again, I didn't see this, not in the passage, or not in what I read about Bialik in the poems. But when does anger become hatred? Because some of the texts that you were showing were not expressing hatred. There was more of an anger about inaction or action or something that happened, even in the post-World War II text that you showed. So I wonder whether you could comment on that. When does anger become hatred? And then going back to the point of the talk of hatred as a political emotion, how that anger turning into hope, or turned into not hope, listen to me, turned into hatred might be politically abused or harnessed by people who may not hate, but who might find it a very useful political tool.
Those are great questions. You're absolutely right. As I'm doing the revisions of the book now, I've been thinking about this. When does it? Because I made that differentiation in the talk, but now I have to think about the consequences of that. Hatred is a condensation or a crystallization, or I would call it a petrifaction, right? It's kind of like petrified anger, because anger is situational and can blow over, whereas hatred stays. And I guess that would be the question is, and Bialik might not be the right example of, a momentary burst of anger, but then basically, one can envision peaceful, right?
To call for action, for something. Let's do something. Let's not sit around and hope, but let's do something, right?
Right. So and I have to think through that a little better, because it's clear that for someone like Greenberg, it's hatred. It's existential, theological hatred. He needs an enemy. And, one reader said, I should bring in Schmidt, and I should bring in Agamben, and I should bring in Gilani Jar, and the necessity of the enemy as a kind of existential, and I might bring that in to clarify the difference between anger and hatred, even though for someone like Schmidt, you don't have to hate your enemy. Your enemy simply has different interests, and you can pursue your own interests quite rationally. Your other question is also a huge one that many readers have raised, and I'm trying to deal with every iteration of this book. On the one hand, of course, you're right, that leaders can take the angers, the resentments, the frustrations, these kind of fluctuating motile emotional states, and they can play on them, and they can consolidate them and strengthen them and harden, solidify them. Hard boundaries, right? Soft boundaries become hard boundaries. The only reason I'm pushing back against this a little is I've noticed something strange in the field of social history, which is that when common people resist hegemony, it's always a sign of agency. And when common people believe that their interests are somehow represented by authority figures, it means that they're being manipulated. And I'm wondering why we only attribute agency to people when they dissent. There must be such a thing as agency and assent, that the leader you're listening to is saying things that you find compelling, that the leader is appealing to some sort of sentiment inside of you, the fear, the anger, the anxiety, and is giving expression to your points of view. And that's really what charismatic political leadership is always about, is that they somehow express your own feelings and your own views in perhaps a more eloquent way and a more compelling way. So a lot of people have told me, this is all about manipulation. Your whole book is about, Zionist or Jewish elites manipulating the public. I think this is really, I find this very unconvincing. I think people have different forms of agency.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack, and you've raised so many points. We are running out of time, but I will, and I will pass the questions that were not asked to Derek. But one question that is quite an interesting one: can we see the emotional roller coaster in the biblical story of Exodus, wandering in the wilderness and conquering and arrival to the land? Do you see any through line?
From a literary perspective, sure. From a historical perspective, no, because I read the Hebrew Bible as a literary text. I don't know how much history is, I don't read the Pentateuch as a historical text. It's clearly a beautifully crafted literary narrative. And there's no question that national movements, state-building enterprises, conceive of themselves in literary terms. And Herzl, of all people, who I wrote a book about, was a dramaturg. And he presented himself, and he presented the whole Jewish national movement, from tragedy to triumph. On the other hand, the Jewish people have had some real material to work with. When you look at the horrors and the catastrophe of the Holocaust, and then the establishment of the state of Israel, it's not an act of fabrication to say Mishoah l'Tikuma. That is not a fabrication. It might be a literary, it might be literary artful, but it's dealing with a reality. So I would say we're dealing with apples and oranges here. We're dealing with a literary story that has become the basis of Jewish self-perception for millennia. And then we're dealing with a historical narrative, which we can then, as Herzl himself did and lots of people have done, we can present it within the framework of the Exodus story. But we're dealing with a real set of historical circumstances here. So I think it's,
right.
Well, that's where
sometimes we try to fit those in these sort of literary meta narratives as well.
Yeah.
So I am very sorry we have to end. It's actually even longer than, but with such
I'm sorry. I thought we had till 5:30. I apologize.
That's fine. It was really, and we'll pass to you all the questions that were asked. So thank you all for joining us. And Derek, thank you so much for sharing this, and to be continued.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.